100 Facts About Napoleon to Fall Asleep To. Our story begins on a small Mediterranean island, where the scent of wild herbs drifts through the summer air. It is August 15, 1769, and in the town of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, a woman named Letizia Ramolino is giving birth. The child arrives into a world barely French at all. Just 15 months earlier, France had purchased this rugged island from the Republic of Genoa, and the ink on that treaty was hardly dry when Napoleon Bonaparte drew his first breath. Had he been born just a year and a half sooner, he would have been Genoese, not French, a small twist of timing that would shape the destiny of an entire continent. The house on Rue St. Charles is modest, filled with the sounds of a growing family. Letizia, a woman of remarkable strength and stern discipline, would bear 8 children who survived infancy, and young Napoleon was her second. In this crowded, boisterous household, attention was a commodity to be fought for, and the boy learned early that the loudest voice or the cleverest mind earned a place at the table. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, carried the title of minor nobility, though their wealth hardly matched their ancestry. Carlo was a man caught between principle and pragmatism. In his younger days, he had fought in the mountains alongside Pasquale Paoli, the great Corsican patriot who resisted French rule. But when the resistance crumbled and France's grip tightened, Carlo made his peace with the conquerors. He understood that opportunity now lay with France, not in feudal rebellion. This practical wisdom would open doors for his children that would otherwise remain forever closed. Young Napoleon spent his early years roaming the rocky hills of Corsica, a landscape of stark beauty where mountains plunge into blue sea. He absorbed the stories of Corsican heroes, of resistance and independence, tales that stirred something fierce in his chest. But his father had other plans. Through careful negotiation with French authorities, Carlo secured something extraordinary for his second son, a place at a French military school on the mainland. In 1778, a small boy of 9 years old stood on the docks of Ajaccio, preparing to leave everything he knew. The ship would carry him first to Autun, where he would spend a few months learning to speak proper French, for until now, he had spoken only Corsican Italian. Then onward to Brienne-le-Château in Champagne, to the military academy that would shape him. Imagine that child, barely tall enough to see over the ship's railing, watching his island home disappear into the distance. He would not know, could not know, that he was crossing from one life into another. At Brienne, the boy found himself utterly alone. The other cadets were sons of French nobility, polished and confident, and they fell upon this strange foreign boy with the cruelty that children reserve for those who are different. They mocked his accent, thick with Corsican sounds. They sneered at his name, so Italian and foreign. They laughed at his family's modest standing. The boy retreated into himself, into his books, into a fierce determination that would one day move armies. While others played, Napoleon read. History, geography, mathematics, he consumed knowledge with a hunger that startled his teachers. He showed a particular gift for numbers and for problems of fortifications and artillery, subjects that required both precision and imagination. His instructors noted his extraordinary memory, the way he could recall entire pages of text, the way he could focus on a problem with such intensity that the world around him seemed to vanish. In just 5 years, he completed what usually took 6, graduating 42nd out of 58 students. It was not a brilliant ranking, but those numbers masked a mind uniquely suited for war. At 15, in 1784, Napoleon moved to the École Militaire in Paris. The capital city was a revelation, a place of lights and ideas, where philosophers argued in cafes and the old certainties were beginning to crack. Here, the awkward Corsican boy continued his transformation. He tore through the 2-year program in a single year, such was his focus and ability. In September 1785, at just 16 years old, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. His first posting sent him to Valence, a garrison town along the Rhone River. For a young officer, it was a quiet life, perhaps too quiet. His salary was modest, 1,120 livres per year, barely enough to live on, and yet he sent money home to Corsica, to his mother and siblings, even as he counted his own coins carefully. He filled his free hours with reading Rousseau, Voltaire, the philosophers who questioned everything. He filled notebooks with his thoughts and dreamed of writing a history of Corsica. He was caught between two worlds, Corsican in his heart, French by uniform and circumstance. The years drifted by: 1786, 1787, 1788. Napoleon spent much of this time away from his regiment, taking extended leaves to return to Corsica. He became entangled in the island's politics, still nurturing dreams of Corsican independence. He was there, on his island home, when the news arrived in the summer of 1789. Paris had exploded. The Bastille had fallen. The old world was coming apart. As France descended into revolution, everything changed. The rigid hierarchies that had kept talented men in their place began to crumble. Noble birth no longer guaranteed command. Suddenly, ability mattered, ambition mattered. For a brilliant young officer with nothing to lose, revolution was not catastrophe, it was invitation. But Napoleon still had to choose. By 1793, Corsica had become a battleground again, and his former hero, Paoli, was leading a new movement that opposed revolutionary France. Napoleon, now 23, found himself on the opposite side from the man he had once idolized. The break was bitter and final. Paoli's forces drove the Bonaparte family from Corsica. They fled to France as refugees, carrying what they could. Napoleon would never see his birthplace again, not as a home. He had cast his lot with France completely now, for better or worse. And so our young officer stood at a turning point, a man without a country who had chosen his path. The old world was dying around him, and somewhere in the chaos, opportunity was waiting. Napoleon Bonaparte was ready to reach for it. The young artillery officer needed a stage for his talents, and in September 1793, fate provided one. The port city of Toulon, on France's Mediterranean coast, had fallen into the hands of royalist rebels who had invited in the British and Spanish navies. For revolutionary France, this was both a wound and an embarrassment, a major naval base held by foreign powers on French soil. The revolutionary government was desperate to take it back. Napoleon arrived at the siege of Toulon as a captain of artillery, but the officer in charge of artillery had been wounded, leaving a gap that needed filling. He was just 24 years old, unknown, unremarkable to those who saw him, a short, thin young man with intense eyes and nervous energy. But when he studied the geography of Toulon, he saw what others had missed. The key was not the city itself but a promontory called L'Aiguillette, which commanded the harbor. Control that high ground, Napoleon argued, and you control where the British ships can safely anchor. Take L'Aiguillette, and you take Toulon. The representatives of the revolutionary government, desperate for any plan that might work, listened. They gave him men and guns. Napoleon positioned his artillery with mathematical precision, working day and night, often sleeping beside his cannons. When the moment came, his batteries opened fire on the British fleet. The ships, suddenly vulnerable, had no choice but to withdraw. Without naval support, the royalist position collapsed. On December 19, 1793, Toulon fell back into French hands. The victory made Napoleon's reputation overnight. For his role in the siege, he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24, an almost unimaginable leap for someone of his background in the old world, but this was the new France, where a clever plan and decisive action could elevate a man in weeks. He had proven something essential: he could see the battlefield differently than other men, and he could turn that vision into victory. But fortune is a fickle companion. The revolution was eating itself, faction turning on faction in an orgy of suspicion and violence. Napoleon had befriended Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of Maximilian, the man who had become the face of the terror. It was a dangerous connection. In July 1794, the Robespierres fell from power and went to the guillotine. Napoleon, associated with them, was arrested and briefly imprisoned. For 2 weeks, his future hung by a thread. He might have followed his patrons to the scaffold, just another forgotten victim of revolutionary paranoia. But the charges were eventually dropped. He had not been involved in politics, only in military matters, and he was released. Still, the suspicion clung to him. He was given minor commands, assignments that kept him away from real action. By 1795, Napoleon found himself in Paris, underemployed and frustrated, living in a small apartment and wondering if his moment had passed. He was 26 years old, a general in name but without an army, watching other men receive the opportunities he craved. He spent his time reading, planning, waiting. Then came October 5, 1795, the 13th Vendemiaire in the revolutionary calendar. Royalist forces rose up in Paris, thousands of armed insurgents marching on the National Convention. The government needed someone who could stop them quickly and decisively. Paul Barras, a powerful member of the Directory that now ruled France, remembered the young general from Toulon. He gave Napoleon command of the troops defending the convention and just hours to prepare. Napoleon's solution was characteristically direct. He sent a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat racing across Paris to seize 40 cannons before the Royalists could take them. When the insurgents advanced the next day, they found themselves facing artillery positioned at key intersections. Napoleon gave the order to fire. The cannons loaded with grape shot, small metal balls that turned each gun into a giant shotgun, tore through the Royalist ranks. Within hours, it was over. The streets were cleared, the rebellion crushed. Napoleon had saved the government with what he would later call a whiff of grape shot. Gratitude from the Directory came swiftly. Napoleon was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior and became a figure in Parisian society. More importantly, he was given the command he had been dreaming of. He would lead the Army of Italy against Austria and its allies. It was not a prestigious posting. The Army of Italy was undersupplied, underpaid, and demoralized, fighting in the shadow of larger armies on other fronts. But it was an army, and it was his. Before he left for Italy, something else happened that would change his life. At a salon, he met a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais. She was 6 years older than him, a widow whose husband had been guillotined during the Terror, elegant and sophisticated in ways that the intense young general was not. She moved through Parisian society with an ease that he could only watch and admire. He fell for her completely, desperately, writing her passionate letters filled with the same intensity he brought to military planning. They married on March 9, 1796, in a civil ceremony. He was 26, she was 32. On his wedding certificate, he added 18 months to his age and she subtracted 4 years from hers, a small mutual deception that suggests something about how they each wanted to be seen. 2 days after the wedding, Napoleon left Paris to take command of his army in Italy. He had barely any time for a honeymoon, war was calling, and he was eager to answer. When Napoleon arrived at his headquarters in Nice, he found an army that matched its reputation. The soldiers were ragged, many without proper shoes. They hadn't been paid in months. Supplies were scarce. Morale was lower than the winter snow on the Alps that separated them from their Austrian enemies. But when the young general addressed his troops, they saw something in him, a confidence, a certainty that he knew how to win. He promised them that he would lead them into the richest plains of Italy, where there would be honor and glory and spoils enough for everyone. He asked only that they trust him and follow. What happened next would become legend. Napoleon divided his enemies and conquered them piece by piece, moving his army with a speed that left the Austrians bewildered. Within weeks, he had won battles at Montenotte, Malesimo, and Dago. Within months, he had driven the Austrians out of northern Italy and forced the Kingdom of Sardinia to make peace. City after city opened its gates to him. His ragged army became victorious, and victory brought everything he had promised: money, supplies, and glory. Back in Paris, the Directory watched with growing amazement and unease. They had sent this young general to a backwater front expecting little, and he was remaking the map of Italy. The newspapers were full of his victories. Napoleon became a name on everyone's lips. He was winning not just battles but fame, that most valuable currency in revolutionary France. And he was doing it all far from Paris, beyond the Directory's direct control, creating facts on the ground faster than they could issue him orders. By the time Napoleon crossed into Austria itself in 1797, the Austrians had no choice but to sue for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio, which he negotiated himself without waiting for approval from Paris, ended the War of the First Coalition. France gained the Austrian Netherlands and the left bank of the Rhine. Napoleon created new republics in northern Italy under French influence. He was 27 years old, and he had won a war. When he returned to Paris in December 1797, he returned as a conqueror. The city turned out to celebrate him. He was no longer just another general, he was France's hero, young and brilliant, wreathed in an aura of invincibility. The Directory honored him with ceremonies and celebrations, but behind the pomp, they worried. This young man was too popular, too successful, too ambitious. They needed to find something to do with him, some way to channel his energy away from France itself, where a popular general might become dangerous to their own power. In May 1798, a vast fleet assembled in the harbors of southern France. Nearly 400 ships prepared to carry an army across the Mediterranean, and with them came something unusual for a military expedition: scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers. Napoleon had recruited over 160 savants, men of learning who would study and document everything they found. This would be not just a conquest but a mission of discovery, a campaign that would bring the wonders of ancient Egypt back to European consciousness. The fleet sailed from Toulon with its destination kept secret even from most of the men aboard. The journey across the Mediterranean was tense with danger. The British fleet, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, was hunting for them, but through a combination of luck and careful navigation, Napoleon's armada slipped past. On June 10, they seized Malta from the Knights Hospitaller with barely a shot fired, staying just long enough to reorganize and resupply before pressing on toward their true destination. On July 1, 1798, the French fleet anchored off the Egyptian coast near Alexandria. Napoleon gave orders for an immediate landing. His soldiers waded ashore onto beaches they had never imagined seeing, under a sun more merciless than any they had known. Alexandria fell within hours, and Napoleon issued a proclamation to the Egyptian people declaring that he came as a liberator, as a friend to Islam, as an enemy only to the Mamluks who ruled them. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, though whether the Egyptians believed it was another matter entirely. The march to Cairo was an ordeal that tested the army's endurance. The soldiers trudged through desert sand under blazing heat, tormented by thirst and heat exhaustion. They had expected the riches of Italy; instead, they found themselves in a landscape of sand and suffering. Some men went mad from the heat. Others deserted. But Napoleon drove them forward with the promise that Cairo, with its wealth and water, lay just ahead. On July 21, 1798, near the village of Mbaba in sight of the pyramids, Napoleon's army faced the Mamluk warriors. These were legendary horsemen, fierce and proud, their weapons encrusted with jewels, their reputation built over centuries. Napoleon ordered his infantry to form hollow squares, formations that bristled with bayonets and muskets on all sides. When the Mamluk cavalry charged with their traditional courage, they broke against these squares like waves against rock. French musket fire and artillery cut them down in swaths. By evening, the Battle of the Pyramids was over, and Cairo lay open before the victorious French. Napoleon established himself in Cairo, ruling Egypt like a pharaoh while his scholars fanned out across the land. They measured the pyramids, sketched the temples, documented hieroglyphics that no European could yet read. One of his engineers, Pierre-François Bouchard, would soon discover the Rosetta Stone, the key that would eventually unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing. Napoleon attended the lectures of his savants, discussed mathematics and engineering, imagined grand projects to modernize Egypt. He seemed to have found a kingdom in the east. But disaster was approaching from the sea. Admiral Nelson had finally found the French fleet, anchored in Abu Qir Bay near the mouth of the Nile. On the evening of August 1, 1798, Nelson attacked. The Battle of the Nile raged through the night, fire and cannon shot lighting up the darkness. By morning, it was a catastrophe for France. Of the 13 French ships of the line, 11 were captured or destroyed. Napoleon's fleet was annihilated. The army that had sailed so confidently across the Mediterranean was now stranded in Egypt, cut off from home with no way to receive supplies or reinforcements. Napoleon tried to put the best face on the disaster, but he knew what it meant. He was trapped. To maintain the illusion of control, he pushed forward with new plans. If he could not return to France by sea, perhaps he could expand his Eastern Empire by land. In February 1799, he led his army northeast into Syria, intending to march on Constantinople itself. It was an echo of Alexander's campaigns, but Napoleon was not Alexander, and this was not Alexander's age. The siege of Acre proved his undoing. The fortress city on the coast of Syria was defended by Turkish forces aided by British naval guns and advised by a French émigré officer who knew Napoleon's methods well. The siege dragged on for 2 months. Napoleon's army, already weakened by disease and the brutal campaign through the desert, threw itself against Acre's walls again and again. Plague broke out among the troops, bubonic plague, the ancient terror. Napoleon visited the sick in the hospital, touching the afflicted to show he did not fear contagion, but his courage could not stop the disease from spreading. By May 1799, Napoleon had to admit defeat. He had lost thousands of men to battle, disease, and desertion. The siege of Acre was abandoned, and the army retreated back to Egypt. It was Napoleon's first clear defeat, a reversal that tarnished his aura of invincibility. The march back to Cairo was a nightmare of heat and exhaustion, with sick men stumbling through the sand and the army's morale crumbling with each step. Back in Egypt, Napoleon received newspapers from Europe that were months old. He read them in his headquarters, learning of French defeats in Italy and Germany, learning that the revolutionary government was weak and unpopular, learning that France itself was in chaos. The directory that had sent him to Egypt was failing. The revolution was devouring itself once more. And here he was, stuck in Egypt, his great adventure turning into a gilded cage. Then, in August 1799, Napoleon made a decision that would define his character for history's judgment. He decided to abandon his army in Egypt and return to France. He told only his closest officers, sworn to secrecy. He could not take the whole army, there were no ships enough for that, and besides, someone had to maintain the fiction of French control over Egypt. So he would take a handful of officers and slip away in the night, leaving General Kleber in command of an army that did not know its commander was deserting it. On August 23, 1799, Napoleon and a small party boarded frigates at Alexandria and sailed for France. They evaded British patrols through a combination of speed and luck, hugging the North African coast before striking north across the Mediterranean. For 6 weeks, they were at sea, cut off from news, not knowing if France still stood or if the government had fallen. Napoleon spent the voyage reading, planning, imagining what he would find when he arrived home. On October 9, 1799, Napoleon landed at Fréjus on the southern coast of France. The news of his return spread like wildfire. Despite the disaster in Egypt, despite the army he had left stranded, the people greeted him as a returning hero. France was exhausted by war and instability, and here was the young general who had never lost a battle on European soil, who had conquered Italy, who carried with him the mystique of the East. The timing of his return could not have been more perfect. Napoleon made his way to Paris, and everywhere he went, crowds gathered to see him. The Directory was weak, divided, paralyzed by factionalism. The constitution they governed under was Byzantine and unworkable. France needed stability, order, decisive leadership, or so many people had come to believe. And Napoleon, reading the room with the same genius he brought to reading a battlefield, understood that the moment had come. Conspirators approached him, Talleyrand, the cunning foreign minister, Size, a member of the Directory who hated his colleagues, his own brother Lucien, who held the crucial position of president of the Council of 500. They whispered to him of a plot to overthrow the government, to replace the failed Directory with a new system, a consulate, with Napoleon at its head. It would require careful timing, loyal troops, and a willingness to cross the Rubicon from general to politician, from servant of the state to master of it. Napoleon listened to their plans, added his own ideas, and agreed. The conspiracy was set for November 9, 1799, the 18th Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. It would be a coup d'état, carried out in the name of saving the Republic. Whether it would succeed or end with Napoleon facing a firing squad would depend on nerve, timing, and the loyalty of a few hundred soldiers. The morning of 18th Brumaire arrived with autumn chill in the air. Napoleon rode to St. Cloud, where the government had been moved under the pretext of a Jacobin threat. His brother Lucien worked inside the chambers, trying to manage the representatives. Napoleon entered the Council of 500 in his general's uniform, intending to address them, to convince them to dissolve themselves peacefully and make way for a new order. But the deputies were not convinced. They saw a general in their chamber where no general should be, and they shouted him down. "Outlaw him," some cried, remembering Robespierre's end. Napoleon, usually so composed under cannon fire, seemed shaken by the hostility. He stammered, lost his words, and had to be escorted out by his guards. The coup was unraveling before it had truly begun. Outside, Napoleon's brother Lucien made a desperate gambit. As president of the council, he came out to address the soldiers guarding the building. He told them that assassins inside threatened the deputies with daggers, that the Republic was in danger, that the army must act. It was a lie, but it was a convincing lie. The soldiers, loyal to Napoleon and skeptical of politicians, believed it. Murat, the dashing cavalry officer who had seized the cannons for Napoleon 4 years earlier, led troops into the chamber. The deputies fled through windows and doors, their robes flapping as they ran. By evening, it was over. The Directory was dissolved. A new government was proclaimed, the Consulate, with 3 consuls at its head. Napoleon was named first consul, the others mere supporting players in his drama. He was 30 years old, and he had just made himself the ruler of France. The Republic still existed, at least in name, but everyone understood that one man now held the power. Napoleon's first words as first consul were characteristically bold: "Citizens, the revolution is established upon the principles which began it. It is ended." With that pronouncement, he drew a line under a decade of chaos and terror. The revolution was over, the age of Napoleon had begun. France, exhausted and hungry for order, seemed ready to accept this new master who promised stability wrapped in the rhetoric of republican virtue. As first consul, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate his power and transform France from within. One of his earliest and most enduring achievements was the creation of a new legal framework that would outlast his empire. In March 1800, he established a commission of 4 legal experts to draft a unified civil code for France. For centuries, France had been a patchwork of different legal systems: Roman law in the south, customary law in the north, each region with its own traditions and contradictions. Napoleon wanted one law for all French citizens, clear and rational. He didn't simply delegate this task and forget it. Napoleon personally attended more than half of the commission's meetings, often presiding over debates that stretched late into the night. He had a sharp legal mind and strong opinions about how society should be organized. The resulting Code Civil, later known as the Napoleonic Code, was promulgated in 1804. It enshrined principles that seem obvious now but were revolutionary then: equality before the law, the right to own property, the secular nature of the state, religious tolerance. The code would be adopted, in whole or in part, by dozens of countries across Europe and beyond, becoming one of Napoleon's most lasting legacies. But legal reform was only one front in Napoleon's reorganization of France. He also turned his attention to the chaos of French finances. The revolutionary government had left the treasury in shambles, with worthless paper money and no reliable system for collecting taxes. In January 1800, Napoleon established the Banque de France, a central bank that would stabilize the currency and manage the state's finances. It was a pragmatic solution that combined state oversight with private investment, and it worked. Within months, confidence in French money began to return, and with it came economic recovery. Napoleon understood that winning the loyalty of the French people required more than good laws and stable currency. It required addressing their spiritual needs as well. The revolution had been hostile to the Catholic Church, confiscating its property, persecuting its priests, even attempting to replace Christianity with a cult of reason. But most French people remained Catholic at heart, and the rupture with Rome was a wound in the nation's soul. Napoleon, though not particularly religious himself, recognized the practical value of reconciliation. In 1801, after lengthy negotiations, Napoleon signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. This agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, though not as the official state religion. The Church accepted the loss of its confiscated lands but regained the right to operate openly in France. Priests would be paid by the state, making them effectively government employees, which meant Napoleon could control them even as he restored them. It was a masterpiece of political calculation, giving people their faith back while ensuring that faith would not challenge his authority. While reforming France internally, Napoleon also had to deal with the war that still raged across Europe. Austria, Russia, and Britain remained at war with France, and the military situation when he took power was dire. French armies were losing ground in Italy and Germany. Napoleon knew that dramatic military success was essential to securing his position at home. A ruler who presided over defeats would not last long. In May 1800, Napoleon made a bold and risky move. He personally led an army across the Alps into Italy, following ancient passes that Hannibal had supposedly used 2,000 years before. It was a grueling march, soldiers and horses struggling through snow and ice, artillery pieces disassembled and dragged over mountain paths, the whole endeavor a logistical nightmare that Napoleon somehow turned into reality through sheer force of will. The famous image of Napoleon crossing the Alps on a rearing white horse, painted by Jacques-Louis David, captured the mythic quality he cultivated, though in reality he probably made much of the crossing on a mule. The Alpine crossing surprised the Austrians completely. They had expected Napoleon to attack through the obvious routes, not to appear behind them after crossing mountains with a full army. On June 14, 1800, the armies met at Marengo in northern Italy. The battle began badly for the French. By afternoon, Napoleon's forces were in retreat, and he sent word to Paris that he had lost. But then General Desaix arrived with reinforcements at the crucial moment. The French rallied, counterattacked, and turned defeat into victory. Desaix was killed in the fighting, dying in his moment of triumph, but his arrival had saved both the battle and Napoleon's reputation. Marengo was portrayed in Paris as a brilliant victory, proof of Napoleon's genius, though in truth it had been a near disaster rescued by luck in Desaix's timely arrival. But what mattered was the perception. Napoleon had crossed the Alps like Hannibal, defeated the Austrians like Caesar, and restored French control of Italy. The victory allowed him to negotiate from strength, and in 1801, Austria signed the Treaty of Lunéville, accepting French dominance in Italy and the Low Countries. With Austria out of the war, only Britain remained, and Britain could not be beaten on land. It was an island fortress protected by the most powerful navy in the world. Neither side could strike a decisive blow. The war had become a stalemate of raids and blockades, expensive and exhausting. In 1802, Napoleon and the British government agreed to the Treaty of Amiens, a peace that both sides knew was probably temporary but both welcomed nevertheless. For the first time in a decade, France was at peace with all of Europe. The peace allowed Napoleon to turn his attention to a different frontier, the Americas. France had once possessed a vast colonial empire in the New World, but much of it had been lost in previous wars. Louisiana, the enormous territory west of the Mississippi River, had been ceded to Spain but recently returned to French control. Napoleon dreamed of rebuilding French power in America, with Louisiana as the foundation and the sugar-rich island of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, as its crown jewel. But Saint-Domingue was in rebellion. Enslaved people, led by the brilliant former slave Toussaint Louverture, had risen up during the Revolution and established their own government. Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, with an army to retake the island and restore slavery. The campaign was a disaster. The French army faced fierce resistance from the rebels and was decimated by yellow fever, a disease that killed Europeans far more readily than it killed those born in the tropics. Leclerc himself died of fever. Tens of thousands of French soldiers perished, and still the island would not be subdued. The failure in Saint-Domingue convinced Napoleon that his American ambitions were unworkable. If he could not hold Haiti, he could not support Louisiana, which would require Haiti's resources to be viable. And with war with Britain likely to resume, Napoleon knew the British Navy would cut off any French territory in America anyway. In 1803, he made a stunning decision. He would sell Louisiana to the United States. The young American Republic, eager to expand, jumped at the offer. The Louisiana Purchase, as it came to be known, was one of the largest land sales in history. France sold approximately 828,000 square miles, land that would eventually become 15 American states, for $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre. For the United States, it was the bargain of the millennium, doubling the country's size at a stroke. For Napoleon, it was a pragmatic decision to turn useless territory into cash he could use to fund his wars in Europe. He needed money more than he needed empty land across an ocean he did not control. The peace with Britain, meanwhile, was crumbling exactly as everyone had expected it would. The Treaty of Amiens had papered over fundamental disagreements without resolving them. Both sides accused the other of violating its terms. British newspapers attacked Napoleon relentlessly, and he took their criticism as an insult to France itself. In May 1803, barely a year after the peace was signed, Britain and France were at war again. This time, Napoleon decided that Britain itself must be invaded. He assembled a vast army along the French coast at Boulogne, training them day and night for the crossing of the English Channel. He commissioned hundreds of flat-bottomed boats to carry his soldiers across the water. He told his marshals that if his fleet could control the channel for just 6 hours, he could land in England and force British surrender. The Army of England, as it was called, grew to nearly 200,000 men, the largest invasion force ever assembled to cross the Channel. But there was one insurmountable problem: the British Navy. As long as Admiral Nelson and his ships patrolled the Channel, no French invasion fleet could cross. Napoleon devised elaborate plans to lure the British fleet away, to concentrate his scattered French and Spanish ships and achieve local superiority for just long enough to get the army across. But Nelson was not so easily fooled, and the British Admiralty kept their ships stationed like watchdogs between Napoleon and his prize. For 2 years, the Army of England waited at Boulogne, staring across the water at the white cliffs they could see but not reach. The soldiers drilled endlessly, becoming perhaps the most well-trained army Napoleon ever commanded. But they could not drill their way across the Channel, and as 1805 wore on, Napoleon's attention was forced to turn elsewhere. Austria and Russia were forming a new coalition against him, preparing to invade France from the east. He could not simultaneously invade England and defend France against the continental powers. In August 1805, Napoleon made his choice. The invasion of England was postponed indefinitely, though he never officially cancelled it, preserving the threat as a tool of diplomacy. Instead, he would march the Army of England eastward and deal with the Austrians and Russians. The camps at Boulogne emptied as the soldiers turned their backs on the sea and began the long march into Central Europe. They were setting out on a campaign that would become known as the greatest demonstration of Napoleon's military genius, the Campaign of 1805. The Austrian army had invaded Bavaria, a French ally, and was waiting for Russian reinforcements to arrive before pushing on toward France. Napoleon saw his opportunity. If he could move fast enough, he could catch the Austrians before the Russians arrived and destroy them in detail. He marched his army with astonishing speed, covering distances that seemed impossible, appearing where his enemies did not expect him. In October 1805, Napoleon trapped an entire Austrian army under General Mack at the city of Ulm. Without firing more than a few shots, he surrounded the city so completely that escape was impossible. On October 20th, Mack surrendered with over 30,000 men. It was a bloodless victory, achieved through maneuver and speed rather than battle, and it opened the road to Vienna. But the war was not over. The Russian army under Tsar Alexander I was still advancing, and the Austrians were gathering what remained of their forces. Napoleon occupied Vienna in November, but he knew that occupying a capital city meant nothing if the enemy's army remained in the field. He needed a decisive battle, a collision that would shatter the coalition's will to fight. And he needed to choose the ground carefully, to find a place where his genius for tactics could overcome the coalition's numerical advantage. The place he chose was Austerlitz, a small town in Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic. It was early December 1805, and winter was settling over Central Europe. Napoleon positioned his army near the town, on seemingly disadvantageous ground, and waited for the Allied army, Russians and Austrians together, to arrive. He had about 73,000 men. The Allies had nearly 85,000. On paper, Napoleon was outnumbered and in a precarious position. But that was exactly how he wanted it to appear. Napoleon spent the evening of December 1st walking among his soldiers' campfires, talking with the men, exuding confidence. The soldiers worshipped him by now. They called him the Little Corporal, a nickname that spoke of affection rather than disrespect. When they saw him, they lit torches made of straw and thrust them into the air, creating rivers of light in the darkness. Thousands of flames flickered across the camp like earthbound stars, and Napoleon, watching this spontaneous tribute, knew his men would follow him anywhere. The next morning, December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, though we will come to that shortly, dawned with thick fog blanketing the ground. Napoleon had studied the terrain carefully. There was a height called the Pratzen Plateau in the center of the battlefield, and he had deliberately left it unoccupied, inviting the Allies to take it. He knew they would see his right flank as weak and try to envelope it, which would require them to move troops off the plateau and extend their lines. And that was when he would strike. The battle unfolded exactly as Napoleon had predicted. The Allied commanders, thinking they saw an opportunity, moved most of their forces south to attack Napoleon's right wing, weakening their center. When the fog lifted around 9 in the morning, revealing the battlefield like a stage curtain rising, Napoleon saw that the plateau was lightly defended. He turned to his marshal, Soult, and asked if his men could take it. "In less than 20 minutes, sire," Soult replied. Napoleon glanced at his watch and said, "Then we will wait a quarter of an hour." When the moment came, French troops surged up the slopes of the Pratzen Plateau. They smashed through the weakened Allied center, cutting the enemy army in two. The Russian Imperial Guard tried to counterattack but was driven back. By afternoon, the Allied army was in chaos. Their southern wing, which had been advancing confidently just hours before, now found itself cut off and forced back onto frozen ponds. French artillery shelled the ice, and hundreds of Russian soldiers drowned in the freezing water as it gave way beneath them. By evening, the Battle of Austerlitz was over. The Allies had lost perhaps 27,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with most of their artillery. Napoleon's losses were about 9,000, steep, but nothing compared to the catastrophe he had inflicted on his enemies. Tsar Alexander wept as he rode from the field. The Austrian emperor sued for peace immediately. Within days, Austria signed the Treaty of Pressburg, giving up vast territories and accepting French dominance in Germany and Italy. Austerlitz was Napoleon's masterpiece, the battle that would be called the Battle of the Three Emperors, and his reputation as a military genius reached its zenith. But let us step back a moment, for there is something we passed over. On December 2nd, 1804, exactly 1 year before Austerlitz, something extraordinary had happened in Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of a minor Corsican noble, the artillery officer who had risen through talent and revolution, had crowned himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral. The first consul had become Emperor Napoleon I. The road to the imperial throne had been carefully paved. In 1802, Napoleon had engineered a plebiscite that made him consul for life. 2 years later, another plebiscite. These referendums always passed with overwhelming majorities that suggested careful management, approved the establishment of a hereditary empire. The Senate proclaimed Napoleon emperor on May 18, 1804. The revolution, which had begun by cutting off a king's head, had given France a new monarch. The coronation ceremony was orchestrated with meticulous attention to symbolism. Pope Pius VII traveled to Paris to consecrate the new emperor, lending the event religious legitimacy. But when the moment came for the Pope to place the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon took the crown from his hands and crowned himself, a gesture that spoke volumes about where he believed power truly resided. He then crowned his wife, Josephine, as empress. The artist Jacques-Louis David captured the moment in a vast canvas that hangs in the Louvre, though he took liberties with reality, including painting Napoleon's mother in the scene even though she had boycotted the ceremony in anger over her son's treatment of his brother. As emperor, Napoleon created a new nobility to surround his throne. He made his most successful generals into marshals of the empire, giving them grand titles and generous salaries. He created dukes and counts, barons and knights, an entire aristocracy built not on ancient blood but on service to him. It was a curious blend of revolutionary merit and monarchical hierarchy. Napoleon wanted the stability and grandeur of monarchy but insisted that the new nobles earn their position through talent rather than inheriting it by birth. After Austerlitz, Napoleon's power seemed unassailable. He reorganized the map of Europe according to his vision. He dissolved the ancient Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for 1,000 years, and replaced it with the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under French protection. His brothers became kings, Joseph received Naples, Louis was made King of Holland, and later Jerome would get Westphalia. Napoleon was creating a family empire, with Bonapartes on thrones across Europe, all orbiting around him like planets around the sun. But there was one power that remained beyond his reach: Britain. The war with Britain continued, an endless struggle between elephant and whale, France dominant on land, Britain supreme at sea. Just weeks before Austerlitz, on October 21, 1805, Admiral Nelson had destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. Nelson died in his moment of victory, shot by a French sniper, but his victory was complete. 22 French and Spanish ships were captured or destroyed out of 33 engaged. Britain's naval supremacy was now absolute, and Napoleon's dreams of invading England were definitively ended. Trafalgar meant that Napoleon could never directly conquer Britain, but he could try to strangle it economically. In 1806, he issued the Berlin Decree, establishing what he called the Continental System. It was an attempt at economic warfare on a massive scale. Napoleon would forbid all European nations under his control or influence from trading with Britain. If Britain could not sell its manufactured goods or buy the raw materials it needed, its economy would collapse, and eventually it would have to make peace on Napoleon's terms. The Continental System required the cooperation of every nation in Europe. Most complied, either because they were French allies or because they feared French armies. But there was one significant exception: Portugal. The small kingdom on the western edge of Europe was Britain's oldest ally and refused to close its ports to British trade. Napoleon decided that Portugal must be forced to comply, and the only way to reach Portugal was to march an army through Spain. Spain was nominally France's ally, ruled by the ineffectual King Charles IV and his scheming son Ferdinand. Napoleon secured permission to send French troops through Spanish territory to invade Portugal. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, and French forces occupied Lisbon in late 1807. But Napoleon's troops remained in Spain, and more kept arriving. Spanish officials began to suspect that something else was happening, that the army marching through to Portugal was actually there to occupy Spain itself. They were right to be suspicious. Napoleon had decided that Spain needed better leadership than the Bourbon monarchy could provide. In 1808, he lured both King Charles and Prince Ferdinand to France, where he essentially forced both to abdicate. He then declared his brother Joseph the new king of Spain. It seemed like another step in building his family empire, but this time Napoleon had miscalculated badly. The Spanish people did not accept Joseph as their king. On May 2, 1808, the people of Madrid rose in rebellion against French occupation. French soldiers were attacked in the streets. Marshal Murat, commanding the French forces, suppressed the uprising with brutal efficiency. The painter Goya would later immortalize the reprisals in his devastating works The 2nd of May and The 3rd of May, showing Spanish civilians being executed by French firing squads. But the repression did not end the resistance, it ignited it across the entire country. Spain erupted in what the Spanish called a guerrilla, a little war, the term that would enter all languages to describe irregular warfare by civilians against an occupying army. Spanish peasants, priests, and former soldiers formed bands that attacked French supply lines, murdered isolated French soldiers, and vanished into the mountains. The French responded with harsh reprisals, burning villages and executing prisoners, which only deepened Spanish hatred and resistance. Napoleon's army found itself fighting an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, a war without front lines or decisive battles. In August 1808, a French army of 20,000 men under General Dupont was surrounded by Spanish forces at Bailén in southern Spain. Dupont, seeing no way out and fearing his army would be massacred if he tried to fight through, surrendered. It was the first time an entire Napoleonic army had surrendered in the field. The news sent shockwaves across Europe. Napoleon was not invincible after all. The myth of French military supremacy was cracked. Britain, seeing an opportunity, sent an army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, to Portugal to support the Spanish resistance. Now Napoleon faced not just guerrillas but a professional British army operating on the Iberian Peninsula. He would have to commit hundreds of thousands of troops to Spain, soldiers who would be desperately needed elsewhere as other enemies began to think about challenging French dominance. Napoleon went to Spain himself in late 1808, leading an army that recaptured Madrid and drove the British back to the coast. But he could not stay. Trouble was brewing in Austria again, and he had to return to Central Europe. The moment he left, the Spanish resistance resumed with undiminished fury. Spain became what Napoleon himself called the Spanish ulcer, a wound that would not heal, constantly draining French strength and resources. The Spanish War demonstrated something that Napoleon's string of brilliant victories had obscured. There were limits to military power. You could defeat an army in battle, but how do you defeat a people who refuse to accept defeat? How do you garrison a hostile country when every village might hide your murderers? Napoleon had conquered nations before, but Spain was different. Spain was showing Europe that the emperor could be resisted, that French armies could be worn down and defeated, that Napoleon was, after all, only human. Austria struck in 1809, hoping to catch Napoleon distracted by Spain. The Archduke Charles, Austria's most capable general, led a reformed and modernized army into Bavaria in April. Napoleon rushed back from Spain and met the Austrian challenge with his customary speed and aggression. The campaign was hard-fought. At the Battle of Ospernessling in May, Napoleon actually lost, one of his rare defeats in a major engagement. The Austrians inflicted over 20,000 casualties on the French, and Napoleon was forced to retreat across the Danube River. It was a stunning reversal that proved the emperor could be beaten in open battle. But Napoleon was nothing if not resilient. He regrouped, brought up reinforcements, and planned his counterattack with meticulous care. In early July 1809, he faced the Austrians again at the Battle of Wagram, just northeast of Vienna. This was one of the largest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, over 300,000 men engaged across a battlefield that stretched for miles. The fighting lasted 2 days and was brutal, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. But Napoleon's tactical genius and the discipline of his soldiers ultimately prevailed. The Austrians were forced to retreat, and by October, they signed the Treaty of Schönbrunn, ceding more territory and paying a massive indemnity. Yet the victory came at a terrible cost. Wagram had killed or wounded over 40,000 French and Allied soldiers. Napoleon was winning his battles, but each victory was purchased with more blood than the last. The seemingly endless supply of French soldiers was starting to thin. And there was a more personal cost as well. The relentless campaigning was wearing on Napoleon himself. He was 40 years old now, no longer the lean young artillery officer who had slept beside his cannons at Toulon. He was gaining weight, suffering from various ailments, and his energy, though still formidable, was no longer inexhaustible. After Wagram, Napoleon made a decision that would have profound personal and political consequences. His marriage to Josephine, the passionate love affair that had begun in 1796, had produced no children. Josephine had 2 children from her first marriage, but she was now too old to bear more. Napoleon needed an heir, a son to inherit his empire and establish a dynasty. In December 1809, he informed Josephine that their marriage must be dissolved. She wept, he wept, but the decision was final. The divorce was formalized in January 1810. Napoleon needed a new wife, and not just any wife. He needed one whose lineage would give his upstart empire the legitimacy of ancient blood. He turned to the old royal houses of Europe, and after some diplomatic maneuvering, he secured the hand of Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria. The irony was rich. Napoleon, who had defeated Austria 4 times, was now marrying into the Habsburg dynasty, one of the oldest and most prestigious royal families in Europe. The wedding took place in April 1810, and Marie-Louise became Empress of the French. In March 1811, Marie-Louise gave Napoleon what he had wanted, a son. The infant was given the title King of Rome, a grandiose name that evoked the ancient emperors. Napoleon was ecstatic. He had his heir, his dynasty was secured, or so he believed. He doted on the child, visiting the nursery frequently, watching the boy sleep, imagining the future emperor who would continue what he had built. But fate had other plans for the King of Rome. Meanwhile, the relationship with Russia was deteriorating. Tsar Alexander I had been Napoleon's ally since their meeting at Tilsit in 1807, where the two emperors had carved up Europe between them on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. But the alliance was fraying. The continental system was devastating the Russian economy. Russia depended on exporting timber, hemp, and grain to Britain, and the blockade was strangling their trade. By 1810, Alexander was quietly allowing Russian merchants to trade with Britain through neutral intermediaries, effectively breaking the continental system. Napoleon could not allow this defiance. The continental system was the cornerstone of his strategy against Britain. If Russia would not comply, Russia must be punished. And so, in the spring of 1812, Napoleon began assembling an army unlike any seen before in Europe. He called it the Grande Armée, and it was truly grand in scale, over 600,000 men drawn from France and every nation under French control or alliance. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, a polyglot force that spoke a dozen languages, united only by Napoleon's command and the eagles on their standards. In June 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon expected a quick campaign. The Russians would meet him in battle near the border. He would defeat them decisively as he had defeated every other continental army, and Tsar Alexander would have to sue for peace. But the Russians did not cooperate with his plan. Instead of standing and fighting, they retreated, burning crops and villages as they went, implementing a scorched earth policy that denied the French army the supplies it needed to live off the land. Napoleon pressed forward, chasing the retreating Russian army deeper into the vast country. His supply lines stretched longer and longer, becoming tenuous threads connecting him to Poland and France. The Russian summer was hot and dry, the roads turned to dust, and soldiers began falling out of the march from exhaustion and disease. The army that had crossed the border at over 600,000 strong was already shrinking before it had fought a major battle. Finally, in September 1812, the Russians turned to fight at the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 men clashed in a battle that lasted from dawn until evening. The fighting was savage. Artillery batteries fired at point-blank range, infantry charged and countercharged over corpses piling in the autumn fields. The village of Borodino changed hands multiple times, each assault leaving more dead in its wake. By nightfall, perhaps 70,000 men lay killed or wounded on the battlefield, 30,000 French, 40,000 Russian. Napoleon won the field, the Russians retreated, allowing him to claim victory, but it was a hollow triumph. He had not destroyed the Russian army as he had destroyed the Austrians at Austerlitz. The Russians were still intact, still retreating, still drawing him deeper into their country. And Napoleon had lost another 30,000 men he could not replace, men he would desperately need in the months to come. A week after Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow. The ancient capital of Russia lay before him, seemingly abandoned. The French soldiers wandered through empty streets, occupying palaces and churches, waiting for Russian officials to arrive and negotiate surrender. But no one came. And then, that night, fires began. Moscow was burning, whether deliberately set by Russian patriots or accidentally started by French looters. The result was the same. For 3 days, the city burned. 3/4 of Moscow was destroyed, leaving Napoleon's army occupying a blackened ruin as autumn turned toward winter. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to offer peace terms. He sent messages proposing negotiations, but Alexander did not reply. The silence from St. Petersburg was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Napoleon finally understood there would be no negotiated peace. The Russians would rather burn their own cities than submit to him. And he was sitting in the ruins of Moscow with winter approaching, his army hundreds of miles from home, his supply lines harassed constantly by Cossacks and partisans. On October 19, 1812, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. The Grande Army turned its back on Moscow and began the long march home. At first, the retreat was orderly, but as the weather turned cold and then bitter, discipline began to crumble. November brought the Russian winter in earnest: snow, ice, temperatures that dropped so low that men froze where they stood. Soldiers abandoned their weapons to wrap their hands in rags. Horses died by the thousands, leaving artillery pieces and supply wagons stranded in the snow. The retreat became a nightmare. Russian forces harried the French column constantly, attacking stragglers, cutting off isolated units. At the Berezina River in late November, the French army had to cross on makeshift bridges while Russian forces attacked from 3 sides. Thousands died in the freezing water or were cut down on the riverbanks. The crossing of the Berezina was a catastrophe that destroyed what remained of the Grande Army's cohesion. By the time the remnants of Napoleon's army straggled back across the Russian border in December, the destruction was nearly complete. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia in June, fewer than 100,000 returned. Perhaps 400,000 were dead from battle, disease, cold, and starvation. Another 100,000 had been captured. It was the greatest military disaster in European history up to that point, a catastrophe so complete that it defied comprehension. Napoleon himself had left the army in early December, racing back to Paris in a sleigh. He needed to reach France before news of the disaster sparked revolts or coups. When he arrived in Paris in the middle of the night, he went straight to the Tuileries Palace. Within hours, he was in meetings, planning, organizing, trying to rebuild. He issued a brief bulletin acknowledging the disaster and blaming it on the weather, then moved on as if it were merely a temporary setback. But it was not a setback, it was a breaking point. The disaster in Russia emboldened Napoleon's enemies and shook his allies' confidence. Prussia, which had been forced to contribute troops to the Russian campaign, switched sides and joined Russia against France. Austria, his father-in-law's nation, began making quiet preparations to turn on him as well. Britain poured gold into forming a new coalition. The dominoes were beginning to fall. Napoleon raised a new army with astonishing speed. He was nothing if not a master of logistics and organization. He conscripted young men who should have had a few more years before military service, calling up the class of 1814 and 1813. These teenagers, some barely 16, were rushed through training and sent to join veterans in Germany. The new army was large but green, lacking the experience of the men who had died in Russia. In the spring and summer of 1813, Napoleon fought a series of battles in Germany against the coalition forces. He won victories at Lutzen and Bautzen in May, showing that his tactical brilliance had not deserted him. But these victories were not decisive. The coalition armies retreated but remained intact, and Napoleon could not pursue them effectively because he lacked cavalry, most of which had died in Russia. Without cavalry for reconnaissance and pursuit, he could not achieve the devastating victories that had once forced his enemies to accept peace. By autumn 1813, the situation was desperate. Napoleon faced converging coalition armies from multiple directions: Russians from the east, Prussians from the north, Austrians from the south, and Swedes under his former Marshal Bernadotte from the northeast. In October, they all converged on Leipzig for what would become known as the Battle of Leipzig or the Battle of the Nations. Over 500,000 soldiers, the largest battle in European history before the 20th century, fought for 3 days around the city. Napoleon was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and despite his best efforts, he could not prevent his defeat. On the third day, one of his Saxon contingents switched sides in the middle of the battle, turning their guns on their former French allies. The French were forced to retreat through Leipzig, and during the retreat, the single bridge over the Elster River was prematurely destroyed, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Many drowned trying to swim across, and thousands more were captured. Fade to next segment. The coalition forces followed Napoleon back into France in early 1814. For the first time since the revolution began, foreign armies were invading French soil. Napoleon fell back to defend his homeland with an army that was a shadow of what he had once commanded. He had perhaps 70,000 troops against over 200,000 coalition soldiers advancing from multiple directions. The odds were impossible, but Napoleon fought with a brilliance born of desperation. The campaign of 1814, as it became known, showed Napoleon at his most tactically gifted. With his small, mobile force, he struck at isolated enemy corps, winning victories at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamps in mid-February. He moved so quickly, hitting the enemy from unexpected directions, that his marshals called it the Campaign of the 6 Days. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Napoleon might pull off another miracle, might somehow defeat the overwhelming odds through sheer genius and audacity. But there were too many enemies coming from too many directions, and each victory simply bought him a little more time. The coalition commanders learned to avoid fighting Napoleon directly. Instead, they coordinated their movements to prevent him from concentrating against any single force. When Napoleon marched to attack one army, another would threaten Paris, forcing him to race back. He was dancing between multiple threats, and the dance could not continue forever. By the end of March 1814, coalition forces were approaching Paris. Napoleon wanted to continue fighting, to lead his army in a guerrilla campaign that would make the invaders pay for every mile of France they occupied. But his marshals had had enough. These men who had followed him for years, who had become rich and titled through his victories, were exhausted and saw no path to victory. Marshal Ney, one of his bravest commanders, reportedly told him, "The army will not march." It was perhaps the first time anyone had said no to Napoleon and made it stick. On March 31, 1814, Paris surrendered. Napoleon was at Fontainebleau with what remained of his army when he received the news. The coalition powers offered him terms: he must abdicate, give up the throne of France. In exchange, they would allow him to keep the title of emperor and rule over the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. He would receive a pension and be allowed to take a small guard of soldiers with him. His wife and son would be sent to Vienna, into the care of her Austrian family. Napoleon resisted at first. He contemplated suicide, reportedly taking poison that he had carried since the retreat from Russia, but the poison had lost its potency over time and only made him violently ill. Some of his guards urged him to march on Paris and die fighting. But in the end, reality crushed his pride. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated unconditionally. He signed away his empire with a trembling hand, and the document that had taken him so many years to build was unmade in moments. On April 20, 1814, Napoleon said farewell to his old guard in the courtyard of Fontainebleau Palace. These soldiers, the veterans who had followed him from Egypt to Moscow, stood at attention as their emperor addressed them for the last time. "Soldiers of my old guard," he said, his voice breaking, "I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have constantly accompanied you on the road to honor and glory." He kissed the eagle standard of the guard, embraced General Petit who held it, and then climbed into a carriage that would take him to Elba. Many of the hardened soldiers openly wept. Elba was a small island, just 86 square miles, with about 12,000 inhabitants. Napoleon arrived in May 1814 to begin his reign over this microscopic empire. He threw himself into governing with the same energy he had once applied to ruling Europe. He reorganized the island's administration, improved its roads, modernized its iron mines, and drilled his guard of about 1,000 soldiers. He received visitors and held court, playing the role of emperor in miniature, but the contrast between what he had been and what he had become must have been agonizing. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the great powers of Europe gathered for a congress to redraw the map and restore the old order. The Bourbon monarchy was returned to France, with Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, placed on the throne. Napoleon's marshals and officials mostly made their peace with the new regime, survival men adapting to the restoration. The Congress of Vienna proceeded slowly, with diplomats arguing over who would get what pieces of Napoleon's former empire, dancing and dining while they divided Europe among themselves. But Napoleon was reading the reports that reached him from France, and what he read gave him hope. The restored Bourbon regime was deeply unpopular. Louis XVIII was seen as a foreign import imposed by France's enemies. The economy was struggling. Veterans of Napoleon's armies found themselves dishonored and unemployed. The old emigrant nobles who had fled during the revolution were returning and demanding their confiscated property back. France was unhappy, and unhappy nations could be opportunities for ambitious men. In February 1815, after less than 10 months on Elba, Napoleon made his decision. He would return to France. It was an absurd gamble. He had just 1,000 soldiers, no fleet to speak of, and all the powers of Europe were arrayed against him. But Napoleon had always believed that audacity and timing could overcome impossible odds. On February 26, 1815, he slipped past the British ships that were supposed to be watching the island and sailed for France with his tiny force. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed at Golfe-Juan on the French coast near Cannes. He had returned from exile, and now the question was whether anyone would follow him. He marched north with his small band, heading toward Paris, knowing that the government would send troops to stop him. Everything depended on how those troops reacted when they saw him. The first test came at Grenoble. A battalion of soldiers blocked the road, their muskets ready, orders to arrest or kill the former emperor. Napoleon walked toward them alone, opened his coat to expose his chest, and shouted, "If there is any man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers stared at him for a long moment, and then they broke ranks, rushing forward to embrace him, crying "Vive l'Empereur!" The battalion joined his march. The same scene repeated itself across France. Every unit sent to stop Napoleon instead joined him. Marshal Ney, who had promised King Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, took one look at his old commander and switched sides, bringing his army with him. It was a bloodless conquest, achieved through sheer force of personality and the loyalty Napoleon still commanded from his soldiers. King Louis XVIII fled Paris without a fight, and on March 20, 1815, just 20 days after landing at Golfe-Juan, Napoleon was back in the Tuileries Palace. Europe was shocked and horrified. The powers at the Congress of Vienna immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and began mobilizing their armies. There would be no negotiated peace this time, no acceptance of Napoleon's return. He must be destroyed, finally and completely. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia pledged to put 150,000 men each into the field and to keep fighting until Napoleon was defeated and removed permanently. Napoleon understood that he had to win quickly or not at all. He could not fight all of Europe simultaneously. His only chance was to defeat the armies piecemeal before they could unite against him. The nearest threats were the British Army under the Duke of Wellington in Belgium and the Prussian Army under Marshal Blücher, also in Belgium. If he could defeat these two armies quickly, he might break the coalition's will and force them to accept him back on the throne of France. In June 1815, Napoleon led his army north into Belgium with about 125,000 men. His plan was to drive between Wellington and Blücher, defeat them separately before they could combine forces, and then march on Brussels in triumph. On June 16th, he sent Marshal Ney to hold Wellington at Quatre-Bras while he personally attacked the Prussians at Ligny. The Battle of Ligny was a French victory. The Prussians were badly mauled and retreated. But they were not destroyed, and Napoleon failed to pursue them effectively. He assumed they were retreating east toward their supply lines, when in fact they were retreating north to stay in contact with Wellington. June 17th brought heavy rain that turned the roads to mud and slowed Napoleon's movements. Wellington had retreated to a defensive position near the village of Waterloo, about 8 miles south of Brussels. Napoleon arrived on the evening of June 17th and surveyed the British position. It looked strong. Wellington had placed his army on a ridge with good fields of fire, but Napoleon had beaten Wellington's defensive positions before in Spain. He was confident he could do so again. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawned gray and wet. The ground was sodden from the previous day's rain, making it difficult for artillery to maneuver and for cavalry to charge effectively. Napoleon delayed the start of the battle until late morning, hoping the ground would dry somewhat. It was a decision that would prove costly, giving the Prussians more time to march to Wellington's aid. The Battle of Waterloo began around 11:30 a.m. with a French artillery bombardment. For the next 8 hours, the battle raged across the muddy fields. French columns attacked Wellington's lines again and again, trying to break through, but the British infantry held firm in their defensive squares. The fighting centered on key positions: the farmhouse of Hougoumont, the hamlet of La Haye-Sainte, with both sides suffering horrific casualties as they fought over every building and hedgerow. By late afternoon, the Prussians began arriving on the French right flank. Blücher had marched his exhausted army through the mud to reach Wellington in time, and now 50,000 Prussian soldiers were hitting Napoleon's exposed flank. Napoleon had to divert troops to hold off the Prussians, weakening his attacks on Wellington's center. The battle was slipping away from him, but he committed his reserves, the Imperial Guard, the veterans who had never failed him, in one last desperate attack. The Imperial Guard marched up the slope toward Wellington's lines with the same discipline they had shown on 100 battlefields. But they were exhausted, climbing through mud, into the teeth of British artillery and musket fire. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke. They fell back in disorder, and the cry went up, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. It was the signal that the battle was lost. The French army collapsed into retreat, and the retreat quickly became a rout. Soldiers fled in panic, throwing away their weapons, abandoning their artillery. Wellington and Blücher pursued ruthlessly through the night. Napoleon left the battlefield in his carriage, his army destroyed behind him. By morning, the Grande Armée had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Waterloo was over, and with it, Napoleon's last chance at power. 4 days after Waterloo, on June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He briefly considered escaping to America, starting a new life across the Atlantic, but British ships blockaded every port. On July 15th, he surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, throwing himself on British mercy and asking to be allowed to live in England as a private citizen. He wrote to the Prince Regent, "I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people." St. Helena was a volcanic rock rising from the South Atlantic Ocean, about 1,200 miles off the west coast of Africa. It was one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, accessible only by a weeks-long sea voyage, surrounded by treacherous currents and towering cliffs. The British had chosen it specifically because escape was impossible. Napoleon arrived on October 15, 1815, aboard HMS Northumberland, and saw his prison for the first time, a forbidding island of black rock and green valleys, beautiful in its way, but utterly isolated. He was assigned to live at Longwood House, a damp and uncomfortable residence on a windswept plateau. The house was poorly maintained, with rooms that grew moldy in the island's humid climate. It was a far cry from the palaces Napoleon had occupied, and he complained bitterly about the conditions, but his complaints were ignored. The British government had appointed Sir Hudson Lowe as governor of the island and Napoleon's jailer. Lowe was a stickler for regulations, suspicious and humorless, and he and Napoleon despised each other from the beginning. Napoleon's household on St. Helena consisted of a small group of loyal followers who had chosen to accompany him into exile. There was General Bertrand, his Grand Marshal, Count de Montholon and his wife, General Gourgaud, and Las Cases, who would record many of Napoleon's conversations. These companions provided him with company and maintained the fiction that he was still an emperor with a court, however diminished. British guards surrounded Longwood constantly, and Napoleon was forbidden to leave a small perimeter without British escort, a restriction he found humiliating and often refused to obey. Life on St. Helena fell into a monotonous routine. Napoleon rose late, spent hours in his bath dictating memoirs and letters, received his small circle of companions for meals, played cards in the evening, and went to bed late. He had always been a man of action, and the forced idleness was a special kind of torture. To pass the time, he dictated his memoirs to his companions, reshaping the narrative of his life, justifying his decisions, casting himself as a man who had fought for France and for rational principles against the forces of reaction. These memoirs, which his companions would smuggle off the island and publish, became Napoleon's final campaign, a battle for how history would remember him. He portrayed himself as a child of the revolution, a champion of liberty and equality, conveniently omitting his authoritarian rule and the hundreds of thousands who had died in his wars. He was crafting his legend, understanding that if he could not control his present, he could at least try to control his past. The Napoleonic legend that would inspire later generations was born in the damp rooms of Longwood House. Napoleon's relationship with Governor Lowe deteriorated into a bitter battle of wills. Lowe insisted on treating Napoleon as General Bonaparte, refusing to acknowledge his imperial title. Napoleon refused to see Lowe after their first few meetings, considering him beneath contempt. The governor imposed petty restrictions, limiting Napoleon's access to newspapers, screening his correspondence, reducing his household budget. Napoleon responded with theatrical outrage, complaining in letters that were sometimes allowed to reach Europe about his mistreatment, painting himself as a martyred Prometheus chained to his rock. As the months turned into years, Napoleon's health began to decline. He had always struggled with various ailments, but on St. Helena they grew worse. He complained of pains in his side, nausea, and weakness. He spent more and more time in bed, his once inexhaustible energy draining away. His companions worried, but the British doctors who examined him at Lowe's request found nothing obviously wrong, or at least nothing they considered life-threatening. Napoleon himself began to believe he was dying, though of what he could not say. By 1821, Napoleon was seriously ill. He could barely eat, had lost significant weight, and was often in severe pain. In March, he made his will, dividing his modest possessions among his companions and family, dictating his last wishes with the same attention to detail he had once brought to battle plans. He asked to be buried on St. Helena on the banks of the Seine, amongst the French people I have loved so much, though he suspected the British would never allow his body to return to France. On May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was officially recorded as stomach cancer, though debate about what actually killed him would continue for 2 centuries. Some would claim he was poisoned with arsenic, pointing to high levels found in samples of his hair. Others would argue it was stomach cancer, perhaps inherited from his father who had died of the same disease. Still others suggested the damp conditions of Longwood, poor medical care, and depression had combined to kill him. The British governor insisted on an autopsy, which was performed the next day. The doctors found evidence of a severely ulcerated stomach, possibly cancerous, which they concluded had killed him. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena 4 days after his death, in a quiet valley called the Geranium Valley, which he had mentioned he liked during his walks. The British refused to allow his tombstone to read Napoleon or Emperor. The grave was marked simply with a blank stone, as the French refused to allow General Bonaparte to be inscribed. And so the man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French lay in an unmarked grave on a remote island. News of Napoleon's death took months to reach Europe, traveling by ship at the pace of the wind. When it arrived, reactions were mixed. His former enemies breathed sighs of relief that the man who had terrorized Europe for 2 decades was finally gone and could never return. But there were also those who mourned, who remembered the glory days, who saw in Napoleon's fall and death a tragedy of classical proportions. In France, a generation of veterans remembered their youth, the battles they had fought, the emperor they had loved, and many wept. Napoleon had changed Europe forever, even if his empire had crumbled. The Napoleonic Code remained in force in France and influenced legal systems across the world. The nationalist sentiments he had awakened, even accidentally, would reshape Europe in the decades to come. Germany and Italy, which he had reorganized, would eventually unify into nation-states. The old order had been broken, and though the Congress of Vienna tried to put it back together, the cracks would show. His military legacy was equally profound. Napoleon had revolutionized warfare, the way armies were organized, the speed of campaigns, the concept of living off the land, the use of artillery, the importance of morale and elan. Military academies would study his campaigns for generations. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram became case studies in tactical brilliance. Even his defeats offered lessons. West Point, Sandhurst, and St. Cyr would make Napoleon required reading for every officer. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the idea of Napoleon himself, the notion that a man of talent could rise from obscurity to reshape the world. He had shown that birth did not determine destiny, that genius and will could overcome any obstacle. For better or worse, he had demonstrated what one man with sufficient ambition and ability could achieve. He inspired revolutionaries and dictators, dreamers and despots. Everyone from Simon Bolivar to Adolf Hitler would claim to be following in his footsteps, though the directions they took were very different. In 1840, 19 years after his death, the French government finally succeeded in bringing Napoleon's body home. King Louis-Philippe, hoping to harness Napoleonic nostalgia for his own purposes, sent a mission to St. Helena to retrieve the remains. On October 15, 1840, Napoleon's coffin was exhumed. According to witnesses, when it was opened, his body was remarkably well preserved, his face was still recognizable, his uniform intact. He looked as though he were merely sleeping in his tomb. The coffin was transported back to France on the frigate La Belle Poule. It arrived in France in December 1840, and on a cold winter day, December 15th, a grand funeral procession carried Napoleon's coffin through Paris to Les Invalides. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets to see it pass. Old soldiers of the Grande Armée, now gray-haired and bent, wore their faded uniforms one last time and wept as their emperor came home. The procession was magnificent, orchestrated to remind France of its glory days, and for one day, Napoleon's empire lived again in memory. Napoleon was finally laid to rest in a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides, the military hospital and monument where he remains to this day. His sarcophagus is made of red quartzite, surrounded by sculptures representing his victories and achievements. Visitors descend into a circular crypt to view it, looking down on the tomb from above, as though paying homage to a fallen god. It is one of the most visited sites in Paris, and every year, millions come to stand before the tomb of the man who was once Emperor of the French. The tomb's inscription is simple and grandiose at once: "I desire that my ashes rest on the banks of the Seine, amongst the French people whom I have loved so much." It was Napoleon's wish, expressed in his will on St. Helena, and it had finally come true. The boy from Corsica who had become emperor had come home at last, his journey complete, his story ended, his legend just beginning. In the years after his death, the Napoleonic legend grew. Writers and poets romanticized his story: the lonely exile on St. Helena, the titan brought low, the genius unappreciated by his contemporaries. His nephew, Louis Napoleon, rode this legend to power, becoming first president and then Emperor Napoleon III of France in the 1850s, proving that the Bonaparte name still carried magical power. Songs were written, paintings were made, stories were told, each adding another layer to the myth. And what are we to make of Napoleon now, 2 centuries after his death? He was a military genius who left millions dead. He was a lawgiver whose code still influences legal systems worldwide. He was a dictator who claimed to represent revolutionary ideals. He was a Corsican outsider who became the ultimate French nationalist symbol. He was a man of the Enlightenment who crowned himself emperor. He was all these things and more, a figure too large and contradictory to be easily summarized or judged. Perhaps what makes Napoleon so endlessly fascinating is precisely this complexity. He cannot be simply villain or hero, he was both, and neither. He was a man of extraordinary abilities who achieved extraordinary things, who lifted France to heights of glory and then brought it crashing down. He changed the world through force of will and intellect, leaving scars and monuments in equal measure. He was, in the end, profoundly human, brilliant and flawed, ambitious and insecure, capable of greatness and cruelty, driven by dreams that were sometimes noble and sometimes simply narcissistic. The story of Napoleon is the story of what one person can do, for better and worse. It is a story of ambition without limits, of genius without wisdom, of victory without sustainability. It is a story that warns us about the dangers of unchecked power even as it inspires us with examples of human capability. It is a story that belongs to history but continues to speak to the present. Because the questions Napoleon's life raises, about power, ambition, legacy, the relationship between ideals and actions, are questions every generation must answer for itself. And so we leave him there, in his red tomb under the gold dome of Les Invalides, the Corsican artillery officer who became emperor, the man who reshaped Europe and whose shadow stretches across 2 centuries. His story, which began on a Mediterranean island in the summer of 1769, ended on another island in the South Atlantic in 1821, but in a way, it has never truly ended. As long as people wonder what one person can achieve, as long as we grapple with questions of power and legacy, as long as we study the past to understand the present, Napoleon's story will continue. He is gone, but the questions he raised, the changes he made, and the legend he created remain with us still. Rest now, and let the story of Napoleon drift through your mind like a dream, this tale of a boy from Corsica who reached for the stars and held them, briefly, in his hands before they slipped away.